Alrighty, today I want to talk about advanced material techniques, and we'll focus on metals and glass. I know I touched glass already, even though I didn't want to, but I'll just talk about it a little bit more in depth and we do an example together. I gotta say I was pretty late in preparing this class, so the renders are just low quality. One is really low quality, so don't judge. We can still imagine. So today is not that much about like aesthetics, more about the technical aspects. This is the first example that we will do, where we talk about metal, how we can enhance our materials with stuff like scratches, how we add them, what is the proper way of controlling them, and also working with depth of field with a camera. And after that, we will talk about glass, and this is the example here where I did not finish rendering because it just took so long, and then it was like, nah, I don't want to anymore. It didn't actually take that long, I was just really that late. Where on the left side, we can see how exactly the same glass material just looks awful, but on the right side, the glass material looks a lot better, just because it's a different geometry, so we will explore that as well. So these are the two examples that we will do today. For some reason, they take just super long. I don't know, it's not that much stuff actually, but I guess I just talk too much. Alrighty, I will start first with the first example. Afterwards, we will repeat together. First, I want to create this double torus. I oftentimes like to create these double torus things because it's an interesting shape and it's easy to see how different materials react in a specific light environment, because we have so many different shapes, objects that are intersecting, nice roundnesses. So it's a shape that's often used to test materials. So I just create two toruses, two objects that are a torus. Then I will just rotate one of them by 90 degrees, and I move it backwards by 100 centimeters so that they're nicely intertwining. I also want to make sure that my geometry is nice and round. When I go to display and go cheating with lines, I can see that it's pretty edgy. So I select both objects. I go to the ring segments and I give it 100. So usually if something goes around when you use 100 segments, it's a good value to make it look smooth. Then when it comes to the pipe segments, I think 50 might be a little bit too much, but looks about right, seems to work. So I'll take that one. Then I need some kind of surrounding, otherwise I don't really see much. So I will start by creating a cylinder, and I make it nice and large. So I have kind of like a pedestal. I move it down so that it touches the bottom of the rotated cylinder, like that. And also, of course, make sure that the cylinder here has enough rotation segments. I will choose 100 here as well. Now, for the light setup, I'm just lazy, and I know for reflections, I need something proper to reflect. So I'll create a sky, and in the luminance channel, I will load in the dirt bike track, HDR. Hello. In the editor, I will choose no scaling just to make it look a little bit nicer for me. I drop it on here, and I hit Command R to render, and I can see this is a really nice HDRI. We have a sun, we have hard shadows, we have a nice contrast of colors. So overall, a good start to create a more realistic render. Then I will take the rotated torus, put the other torus inside of it, and then I rotate it around until it looks like it's resting on the cylinder. And then this is my starting point. Let's get to this together. We start by creating a torus and another torus. We take the second torus and rotate it around by 90 degrees. Then we push it back by 100 centimeters, and we should now have this intertwined shape. So far, so good? One very quick thing to throw in here, because I showed it in Hamburg, because a student asked. He wanted to build kind of like a chain, where we have these multiple parts intertwined with one another. And if you ever want to build a chain, what you can do is you can start with a rectangle. I just show you what I showed there. Give it some rounding, make the width less than the height, and make the rounding of the rectangle all the way up. So essentially, we now created kind of like the shape of the capsule, but now just as an element like this. Then we simply use the sweep and the circle, and then we have created a chain like this. Then, if you want to use this in a cloner, we would need a second one as well. So a second one where the rectangle is rotated by 90 degrees, and then we can place it into a cloner. Now this cloner, of course, needs something that it could follow. So here I could create a quick shape with the, come on, B-spline, jip, 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 jip. I put the two sweeps into the cloner, tell the cloner to look at an object, which should be the spline. Sorry. Yeah, this has nothing to do with our project. This is just a quick thing in between. Sorry. Then, instead of a count, I can tell it to be per step. And I can now see how they are nicely and evenly spaced from one another. And I just need to figure out the correct rotation. This looks about right, so 90 degrees here. And then I just tell it what the distance between them should be.
So easy. So easy.
Isn't it? And then,
recording, right? Yeah.
Huh?
You recorded that.
Yeah. So then you could take this path and just move it around, and it will automatically adjust the amount of chain elements necessary for this. Just a little tip in between, and all stuff that we already know. Alrighty, so back to our example. Next, in our scene, we want to add more segments. Just to see them a little bit better, we switch the display from garage shading to garage shading lines. We select both of our elements, and we change the ring segments to 100. We also need to change the pipe segments, and there I will choose 50. So there's no need to create these exact values. You could also just like drag it until it looks nice. Next, I need something where it could sit on. So we create a cylinder. Make sure that you are in the model mode so that you can see the hotspots. You can then change the size of the cylinder, move it down until it's kind of like touching the bottom of one of the torus. Tori? Is it that? As soon as it touches the bottom of one of the tori. Alrighty. Next, we realize the cylinder also has not enough segments. By the way, this is done on purpose, just so that you really see that the element doesn't have enough segments, so you yourself need to increase them to the amount that is necessary for what you want to do with the element. So with the cylinder selected, we will go to the rotation segments, and whenever something goes around, usually a value of 100 works well. But also here, you could have just dragged this until you're like, yeah, looks about right. All right. Now we just need some general light setup. So we create a sky. A new material. In the material, we turn off the color and the reflectance. Only the luminance should be enabled. And in the luminance channel, we will go to texture. And from the files that you downloaded, you take the dirt bike track. Just to make the background in the editor look a little bit nicer, let's also go to the editor channel and go to the texture preview size and change it to no scaling. Then we apply the material to the sky, and when we render, we should have something like this.
Sorry, I just added the dirt bike track. I missed the step, so it came after.
Go to the editor and change the texture preview size to no scaling. That step is pretty optional. It doesn't affect the render in the end at all. It's just the way that the texture looks inside the editor while we navigate around. Alrighty. Lastly, we just want to move our torus around. In order to do that, let's take the horizontal torus and parent it to the rotated torus. Okay.
I turned my thing around and suddenly the picture was upside down and the world was upside down.
Next, after we've parented the elements, we select the vertical torus and we go to something like the right view. It might be also the front view depending on how you rotated your elements. And from there, we just rotate it until it sits nicely on the cylinder. It is fine if there's a little bit of an intersection. We don't have to be too exact here. No one really cares.
Did you rotate both at the same time or only the one?
Well, you only need to rotate one because the other one is parented. So far, so good? Yeah? Good. Then, take a look here. I want to show you something. We will not do it together, but I want to just show it so you know that it's there, but you might not use it in the future. We know that the sky is only working because we have global illumination in the render settings enabled, right? So in our render settings, we have global illumination, also referred to as GI, and it makes sure that when we have a light, the light hits an object and it can bounce. And when we have something like a sky or another material with something in the luminance channel, that material can illuminate stuff around it. So it will act as a light source itself. However, by default, global illumination only has something that is called a primary method, which means it only does what it does once. So a light emits light, it hits an object, and it bounces once to the next object. In reality, it would bounce to the next object and up and down and up and down, and then it would slowly decay until the light just dies. Because that would take a lot of time to calculate, cinema by default only has a primary method. When we only work with a sky as our primary light source, we only have one time that something happens. Only because of the primary method, the light gets emitted from the sky, which means it doesn't bounce from objects. Our render still looks pretty sweet, because we have not just the sunlight in the HDRI, but also a lot of other stuff around it to hit our object. So usually we don't care, it's fine. But if you ever want to create this really clean white look, you might have seen these renders where there's like no materials, no nothing, just some text, and it's just white text on a white background, and it looks awesome. That is because a secondary method is enabled. So let me show you where the difference is. Let's just quickly render this. I'm not saving, doesn't matter. So I just let this render in the background. For the secondary method, we have different algorithms that we can use. We can either stick to the quasi-Monte Carlo, or we can also use something like a radiance cache, radiosity map, or light mapping. Normally, the quasi-Monte Carlo gives us the best and most realistic result. However, the irradiance cache will render a whole lot faster. Do you maybe remember what I said about irradiance cache in the very first session that we had? Probably not. Let me show you. When I right-click on here, I can just quickly show the help file and scroll a little bit down to this example here. So this is what irradiance cache does. Quasi-Monte Carlo looks at every single pixel and it calculates how the light is bouncing on there. For an irradiance cache, it creates these random dots on our elements and it calculates for that dot what that color should be. Then it blends all of these things together. So it creates a low resolution version. Instead of using every pixel, it only uses every 10th pixel, and then it blends between them. However, on every single frame that we render, so if we create an animation, we have different dots, which means we get some really flickering shadows and such, if we use this as the primary method. So that is why I always use quasi-Monte Carlo, even though it takes longer to calculate, but for the main path of the light, it gives us a much better result than the irradiance cache. For the secondary method, because it's just a little bit more light, it's usually totally fine to use the irradiance cache because we do save a lot of render time. So my render should be done. I will now choose the secondary method. Here you can also say how many bounces do we want. Should it bounce just 2 more times or 10 more times? Of course, the more bounces, the more the diffuse depth, that's how they call it. The more bounces we have there, the brighter it will be, but it's kind of like an exponential thing, or like the other way around. So I don't see a difference if I have 10 or 10,000 bounces. It's pretty much the same thing. So usually I stick to the 2. Maybe I try with 5 at some point and see if it makes a big difference. But then I might realize that I could just add a curve in Photoshop and get a pretty similar result that way anyways. But for the initial part, it does make a big difference. So when I now render this, I first get this pre-pass, and then it renders the image. If I now zoom in, and I compare, this is the previous one, and this is the second one. It's not big. It's not like, whoa, a whole different world. But before we looked at this and we were like, this looks fine, this looks sweet and realistic. But now we compare it to this one, and then we realize, this actually makes more sense. In comparison, this looks too dark. It should be lighter. So this one here took a couple of seconds longer to calculate. Right now, it doesn't make that much of a difference, but if we use reflective materials or transparent materials, then this number will grow much, much higher. So you want to be very careful with the secondary method. Only use it if you are really sure that you want to, and don't just like throw it in there because you can, because normally you can't. Okay, so just wanted to show this. For the examples that we have today, it doesn't really make a difference. We don't really see light bounces on reflective materials anyways. Same goes for refractive materials, so transparent ones. So it doesn't really matter, we don't need it. But in this example, we can clearly see what the difference between the two methods is. And if you ever want to create something like a white text on a white background, super clean shadows, this is how you get there. Alrighty, so let me just get rid of this again, because nope. And let me talk about the materials. I will start with a regular metal. I do it first, afterwards we do it together. I talked about a metal briefly. Do you remember what needs to be turned on or off?
The color.
Exactly. A metal only consists of reflection, but it doesn't have a color. So I have reflectance. What would I change in here? Remove the default specular, and I add GGX. Do I have to do one more thing? What does everything have? Huh? What did you say? Huh? Fresnel. And we have two types. We have dielectric and conductor. And which type is used for metal? Nope. Conductor. Conductor is for metal, and every single thing else, glass, water, wood, plastic, that's all the materials that I know. It is dielectric. So for this one, it is conductor. Now, because the metal doesn't have a color, we have to define the color of the metal in the reflectance channel. Hello. Based on how the light gets reflected. First, we usually start with a preset. So for instance, if I want to use gold, I just choose a gold preset. But if I feel like my gold should be a little bit more rosy or a little bit more golden, then I want to go down here to the layer color, because this tints the reflection additionally. So in here, I could, for instance, give it a little bit more of an orangey tint. So I have more of a deeper gold. Or I could go more into a pink to get more of a rose gold color. So we usually start with a preset, so we go already kind of like in the direction where we want to go. And then we can add our own color here on top. In this scenario, I'll just stick for now to the regular color. Maybe I stick to the regular one. All right, so I apply this to my torus, and I can see, all right, so something is already happening. I render it, and I can see this looks, well, nice and metally, but it is just like super smooth. It's like a mirror. So for some parts we might want this, but not for all of them.
Did you keep on the secondary lighting thing now? Or did you just shut up? Or did you shut it off?
I shut it off. Yeah.
That would reflect probably crazy different.
No, there's hardly a difference that we see. Because we don't have any lights or shadows really that are cast on this element. We just have reflection, so it wouldn't be much of a difference there. Probably just our floor would be a little bit brighter in the shadows. So in here, we have one main property that we usually change, and that is the roughness. If I change the roughness to 0, I can already see in the preview here, now I have really a mirror-like, super sharp, chrome texture. If I increase the roughness to, for instance, 50 or so, and I render it, now it looks more like a brushed metal. So for instance, if we look at our laptops, not mine, but yours, we can see that is metal, but we don't see a clear reflection because it's kind of like the structure of your computer is kind of like sandpaper. It has all these super, super tiny bumps on them, and that is imitated with this roughness. So with this, we define how deep are the bumps, and therefore, how smooth does this look like? All right? Now, how can we use this roughness in order to create an interesting structure on the element? Let's first try to put a structure on it and then see how we can add it to the roughness. I will turn off the reflectance and I turn on the luminance channel. I will go into my settings, into the texture, and I will add the seamless grunge texture. It's just one scratchy thing that I found on the internet. I open it up, and I realize, okay, so this looks kind of like ugly in here. Like when I render it, it looks nicer and sharper, but I actually want to see it a little bit sharper in the preview already. So I go to the editor and I choose no scaling. I also go back in my display to the garage shading so I can see stuff a bit better. I realize that this texture looks a little bit stretched too much. So what can I do to fix that? What is the first thing that I would try?
Not wrapped.
The,
Like not wrapped or something like this. The thing that makes it squares.
that would be one option. So first, I will go to the material, and then I don't change the projection because I think the projection works fine. I think I just needed to relax a little bit. So I go to the tiles hue, and I increase the tiles. So as I increase the tiles, I relax the stretching by adding more information. However, right now I can see a seam, but the texture said that it is seamless. So why do I see a seam? Before I didn't see a seam. So when I set this back to 1, no seam, everything's perfect. But as soon as I start dragging this, I start to see a seam. So what do I have to do if I don't want to see a seam? No.
You hide it.
And how do I do that?
I mean, like literally like rotate the texture around to
Nah.
or actually get rid of
I like the way you think, but that's not where I want to go.
You change the projection.
No. So apparently my texture is wrapped around the object once. If it's wrapped around it once, it matches seamlessly, it's fine. Then I changed it so the texture comes out and it doesn't fit here anymore. So what do I have to do to make it fit again?
Mirrors. The mirror thing where it's seamless? No.
Okay, so
That's an option.
no, it's not an option. Okay, so maybe the answer is too simple. Huh?
tiles V.
No. Okay, so maybe it's too simple, but if I have a texture that when it goes around once matches, if it goes around 1.5 times, it doesn't match because the ends are not touching. So I need to have 2 times the texture so that I have, again, a beginning and an end that touches and not an overlap. So if I change this to 2, then it's seamless again. Does it make sense? No?
But then it must be mirroring, because otherwise you would have still a seam somewhere, no?
No, because the texture is already prepared in Photoshop in a way.
That's I got you.
If you're working with a symmetrical shape, do you always work with evens then?
No, when I work with an object where something's wrapped around and I know that this element, if it's wrapped around once, is seamless, then I only do it in even steps. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tiles and not 3.2 tiles or something. Okay, so Photoshop on iPad. Improved lens blur. Oh my god, there's an update. I haven't looked at it yet. Does it show up the next time I open this? I don't trust this one. The object selection tool. Have you tried it? It's kind of like you click on an object and it's like the quick selection, but with AI, because everything needs to have AI these days. So then it just selects the element automatically. Or it can also already detect what you want to select. So for instance, if you have a person standing on the street, you can just say, select subject, and it automatically knows probably you want to select the person, and then it selects the person. But it's like really, really rough, and you need to adjust a lot of the edges and shadows anyways. So it's a nice start, but I don't trust these AI things. And what people call AI these days, it's crazy.
We had the discussion once in the first quarter that a lot of the stuff that we are doing in the job, if it's worst case banners or whatever, do you think that could be replaced by AI? Remember we had this discussion with it? But I was just wondering, did you
Well,
say anything about it? You guys don't know about it?
I know of an agency in Hamburg, quite a big one, and they do a lot of banners for, it's some kind of plane travel company thing. And they have actually built an AI that does it for them, where they just feed it specific elements because they just for years have that specific style, it should look like that. So they just feed it stuff, then they get 10 different variations, and they just choose something, and then it automatically creates the banners in the different formats based on the basic elements that they've created. Like, it's not really an AI, just many people call it that because someone put a lot of effort into something, but it's not, yeah. But it's just an algorithm that someone wrote that just places stuff kind of randomly, but still based on certain rules. But
could be replaced by that in 10 years, maybe
More sounds like
I would-
a template, flexible.
it is then kind of like a template, but you have to look at it in a different way. It's just that the stuff that you do gets easier, which means that the stuff that you do will be different in the future, that you are less stuck on figuring out, like for instance, the smart selection that they have, the object selection. Like in the past, it was super tedious. We didn't have a quick selection. When I started with Photoshop, there was no quick selection. We only had the, oh God, I am old. we only had the magic wand. That was it. So when you had to select an object, you were either using the lasso tool or the pen tool if you were like super advanced, and then you created a selection based from the pen tool. And when you had hairs, you literally drew each single hair. That's what I did when I was younger. And these days it's like, nah, quick selection, you just draw over it, then refine edge, draw over hairs. It makes it beautiful and nice. So it's pretty much the same thing. So back then it was just something that you had to do. So the quality that you put out was a lot reduced because you wasted so much time on creating a simple selection, so you didn't have so much time for other things. So with techniques evolving and taking care of bullshit things that we as a person don't have to do, makes our lives better because we can focus more on the cooler things in life. So I wouldn't think of it like, oh my God, AI will take our jobs. It is more like AI will improve our jobs and gets rid of unnecessary stupid tasks. So I'm really looking forward for AI replacing like basic masking techniques, because no one wants to do it. For instance, when you look at movies and such, everyone is just masking out people. Everything is filmed in front of the green screen. Everything gets replaced later on. And there are some, not really AI things, but there are a lot of programs that can help with that. But most of the time, it is a lot cheaper and easier to just send it to sweatshops in India. So that's what they do. Even here in Germany, if we get a job and there's a person, the green screen was just filmed awful, so you can't do it by keying out a color and you have to literally mask every single frame. if someone in Germany has to do it, then it costs thousands, tens of thousands of euros for an entire commercial. So you just send it to India, and within a day, they work overnight because of time difference, even time saved, and they do it for a fraction of the price. So I think it's nice that when these things that we as people don't want to do get replaced by computers, because then these kind of sweatshops, I mean, they are literally sweatshops. They are just Indian people sitting for almost no money in a cellar doing rotoscoping. So we don't really want to support these kind of working environments. So AI can make sure that these kind of jobs also lose their use. Then you could also say that they lose their jobs. Yeah, I mean, they are always like, I don't know. I don't have the solution for all the world problems. But it can be a step in the right direction, and I don't feel like AI would steal anything from us. If anything, it enhances our lives. Okay, so much for that. So when we take a look at this seamless texture here, and I just double click it so it's an independent layer, and I increase my canvas real quick to 300. If I now duplicate this and I move it upwards, I can see how this fits perfectly. So here I can see there was the seam and there's no seam. So if a texture is prepared like this, then you always want to go in even steps, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, to make sure that it stays seamless on the object itself. So here for the torus, I think 3 by 1 looks about right. I don't know, there's probably math that can calculate that, but I don't care. If it looks good, then it's good. So now I know the texture is applied the way that I want it to. I can get rid of it again by, oops. Yeah. I can get rid of it again by changing the luminance to off and going back to the reflectance. And what I will now do is, super hidden, but everyone should know about it, there's a tiny arrow. I can click this tiny arrow and I can add the texture. Because I've added the texture already in the luminance channel, I can click on this, go to bitmaps, and choose the image that I've already added. So here this makes my life a little bit easier instead of having to go to the ... and whatever. And I can see, So essentially what it does is, it takes a look at this image and it places it on the object. And then it decides if there's a dark color on the image, it will not add roughness. And the brighter the color is on the image, the higher the roughness will be. So this is pretty much what roughness is. Or also what scratches are. Where there's a scratch, it is a rougher surface, and therefore the roughness here should be increased. So I can increase the roughness. I can even alter the image by myself by using what we used last class, the filter. So I go here and I don't find it, I'm blind. There. Filter, then I open it up and I can change the contrast of this, decrease it, or I can increase it. And you can see if I decrease it, it looks more even. It's like already a rough surface with scratches on top. Or if I increase the contrast, I really have dark areas where there's no roughness added and then really strong scratches on top. I can also play around with the brightness and at the end with the lightness itself in order to change the intensity of the overall effect of this. So with this, I have a lot of control over how I want these scratches to affect the metal and what the metal overall should look like. The preview that I get here, however, is only a really rough estimate. It's not really the final end result. So I always need to hit Command R to render in order to see what this actually looks like. So you can see when I render it, it does look significantly different than what my preview showed me. But the preview at least gives me an estimate of what the direction is that I'm going in. And now I've created a really nice scratched metal texture. Lastly, I just want the same thing in gold. It's just a small detail, so I just create another material based on the one that I previously had, go to the layer Fresnel, and I change the preset to gold, and I apply it to the child torus. That was not the child torus. There we go. And now I have these two different scratchy metals. Let's do this together. Alrighty. We start by creating a new material. Alright, we turn off the color, we go into the reflectance, and we turn off the default specula, or delete it by clicking the remove button. We click on add, and we choose GGX. We scroll down, and we choose the layer Fresnel, and there it should be a conductor. As a preset, we could, for instance, take aluminum. Maybe that's a little bit more shiny. So far, so good?
Preset aluminum.
Aluminum, yeah. Aluminum.
What step did I forget if I can't see the Fresnel now?
Next, we don't want to add our texture directly to the reflection strength, to the roughness in our reflection, because it's just too hard to judge. Is it stretched? Is it not? So just to get a better overview of what the texture will look like or how it will be applied, let's turn off the reflectance and turn on the luminance channel. In the luminance channel, we then click on the ... and we add the seamless grunge scratch texture. We then apply this material to the parent torus, and we then realize, okay, it looks pretty blurry, but I know that the texture should look a lot better. So just like with the sky, we go to the editor, and we change the texture preview size to no scaling. So now, it should look something like this. So far, so good? All right, next, we want to go to the tiles hue and increase them, but only in integer steps. So 1, 2, 3, and I would go to 3. So far, so good? Now that we know that the texture is applied the way that we want it to, we open up the material again, turn off the luminance, turn on the reflectance, go to the roughness, click on the tiny arrow on the left of the roughness, and add the texture in here. We can do this quite easily by clicking on the down arrow button. Then we go to bitmaps, and we can choose the image from there because it was already added to our project at some point. Now, if we increase the roughness to something like 50%, in the preview we can already see how the roughness is affected by our texture. And when we take a look at our 3D model in the editor, we can also see how the scratches are added to the material. So far, so good?
Can you go back?
Add the texture underneath the roughness, and then increase the roughness to around 50% or so. All right? Good. Now, in order to have more control over how this texture affects the roughness, we want to add filter options, so brightness, contrast, and stuff like this. We click on the same down arrow button, and when we choose filter, it converts the image into a filter with the image inside. We can now click on the filter button. We can see the image is added in the filter, and here we can then change mainly the lightness, the brightness, and the contrast. So there's no right value or whatever. It's just playing around with it, and in between just rendering and seeing how it is then actually applied.
What did you click to get there?
Just click on the filter button. Next, let's say we are fine with how the texture behaves right now, and we now want a gold version of that. We simply duplicate the material by holding down the Command key and dragging it to the side. Then we open the material up, go back to the reflectance, go to the Fresnel, and change the preset from aluminum to gold. We then apply the gold material to the bottom torus. And enjoy how pretty that looks. Alrighty. So far, so good? Good. Now, it is very important that metals have something that they can reflect. Just to give you a quick example, if I don't have my sky, or if I do have my sky, but I only have a single color, and when I now render this, this does not really look like metal or whatever. It looks really pale, the contrast is missing, and it just doesn't behave correctly. Although, that is not really the right thing to say, because the material behaves correctly. It does exactly what it should. But when the surrounding is not the right one, then it just looks different and awful. So always remember, when working with materials that reflect stuff, make sure that you either have a lot of stuff in your studio that you build, or even if you build a studio, still add an HDRI, just to have this little bit more of extra detail that can happen in the reflections. Okay, the next steps I'll do first. Afterwards, we do it together. Let me see what time we have. 12. We started at 11. Oh, that's fine. I want to talk about the depth of field. In order to add depth of field, we first need to create a camera. I also need to go into the camera, just to see a little bit better what happens. I go to the object, and I give it a more appropriate length, like a portrait lens. Then I figure out a nice view, maybe something like this. Oh, I forgot to do the wood texture here. Let me also do this real quick. So for the wood texture, I just go to the color, to the dot, dot, dot. I choose the wood texture. I also make sure that in the editor I can see it nicely, so no scaling. And I apply it to the cylinder. Here I will actually work with the cubic, so I can very easily scale the texture. It is not seamless, but it's fine, because usually when we have this plywood, it's actually wood planks stacked next to each other. So having an edge like that is not too shabby, actually. Might even help with the look. Now lastly, to make the wood behave the way that it should, I will go to the reflectance, remove the default specula, add GGX, go to the Fresnel and tell it to be a conductor, a dielectric. However, it reflects a little bit strongly and it doesn't really reflect in a realistic way. So when I take a look at this and I render it, it just reflects super, super sharp and shiny, and this wood always has a little bit of a structure. It's not this super polished wood and stuff. It's a little bit more raw. So for that, what would I do to add a little bit of detail on top?
The stuff that makes it seem like it is static. I don't know the name, but you know exactly what it is.
The bump, exactly. However, my image right now doesn't really have that much contrast in it. And there's one thing that actually works a little bit better than a bump. And that is called a normal. Normal maps are also very, very often used in games. Let me just quickly show you. What normal maps look like. This is what normal maps look like. So they are these kind of like purplish things that not only say how high a polygon should be or how high a pixel should be extruded visually, but it can also, it defines it more in a way of in the direction that it should look. A normal map therefore looks a little bit weird, but it can create really nice and super realistic results. This one also looks really nice. Let me try that one, for instance. Oh no, just give me it. Give me. So when I go to Cinema 4D and I just create another object and let's just do it on a cube, that's fine. I don't use any color, anything at all. I just use the normal and I choose the image that I just loaded. Make sure that my scaling is set to none. And then this looks like it's actually geometry. Even though I only have a single polygon, there's no detail at all. But it makes it look like there is actual detail. And this also works well for elements that are even stronger extruded, like this one here, for instance. So now this really gives us the illusion of there being that geometry that we can touch, even though it's not there. It just pretends. So when we look at it from the side, we can see it's just fake. It's a lie. Anyways, so working with a normal map usually is the preferred method. So the bump is something that you do. It's easy and simple. You just have a black and white image. But a normal map usually works a little bit better. It catches the light better, and it looks a little bit better from the side. But of course, if we go too much to the side, then we see that it's a lie. But we have a huge area where it still looks pretty good. To use a normal map, we have to create it ourselves. We can either do that in Photoshop, but we can also do it directly here in Cinema 4D by choosing normal map. And then we just add the same wood texture. Initially, it will look awful because the normal map accepts this, what is the word? Expect. It expects the purple image, but we don't put a purple image in it, so it doesn't behave the way that it should. So after we place the image in here, we need to convert it by going to Effects and choosing the normalizer. And then it will convert our image into a normal map version of it. If I turn off my color, so I just changed the mix strength here, and then I'll look around it a little bit when I get closer, we can see how it just adds this little bit of structure on it. We don't see it that much, but it will nicely affect our reflection later on. So let's put this back on. And on here already we can see how we get these nice scratches on there. Not scratches, but these details. And when I now render this, maybe just in a region like this.
Does it just use the contrast of the JPEG to figure out
Yeah. back there we can already see it. I don't want to zoom in because then it stops the rendering. I'll give it a second. Maybe 5, 4, 3, 2, and now I'm happy with what I see. So here we can see how we have this nice little bit of a structure. Also here in the reflection, it's not just blurry, but we can feel the different dents of our wood texture in there. It's just a small detail, but it just makes everything look a little bit nicer. Speaking of small details, I wanted to share, since we're talking about more advanced render techniques, a render that I did just because I didn't have anything else to do 2 years ago, and I just wanted to see how far I can take stuff. And this is the end result. From afar, it doesn't look too special, but we take a super close look. There are all these super nice realistic details of how the lights are reacting on the element, how there are these tiny little bumps and dents and scratches. Everything I've created myself. So all the textures for the dents I've created myself. Even the lights that we see here are not actual lights. I took a picture of a softbox and I used that picture of the softbox to light up the scene. So I have a more realistic, uneven light, and we can actually see in the reflection the texture of the softbox. I added dust. I added these little dust particles, and I did a lot of post-processing, not in After Effects, but in a similar application in order to play around with these chromatic aberrations and have these bokehs that are more natural. So in Cinema 4D, we usually get these really realistic round bokehs, but with other applications, we can create some that look way more natural. I worked a lot with camera distortions, and something that was the main goal of this, working with something that is called SSS, which stands for subsurface scattering. And subsurface scattering is actually how in reality color happens. So the color that we see doesn't happen because an element has actually this color. But light hits an object and it travels through the object and then it comes back out. So depending on how the light, the different waves of light go into the object and how it then goes out, that is creating the color, because the different waves get dispersed in different ways. So this is usually how color is created. And normally we just work with the color channel, but if we were to work realistically, we would always work with subsurface scattering, but we only use it in 3D if we want to create something that is like really, really taking light through. Like for instance, if we have the skin, because if light hits the skin, we can, What? Oh, sorry. Sorry. Sorry about that. Subsurface scattering, and this is sort of what it is. Like in reality, we can see it here, how light travels actually through the skin, and it is used for different kinds of, for instance, if we have stones that are kind of like thinner where light actually travels through, or if we have something like wax, most of the time it's used for skin, but also here, for instance, for a jade-like material. It's a really, really nice thing for illuminated renderings. Also here, it's just one single light source, but the light hits the object and it travels through the object. It takes a lot of time to render though.
So we can create like a realistic looking person in Cinema 4D, right? Like with the skin and
yeah.
hair texture.
Just takes a lot of time and effort. So sometimes if they are like really geeky people, they start with a photogrammetry model of a person, and then they spend a couple of weeks just creating textures and lights for that model. And these are already people that know what they do, but it just takes a lot of playing around with it.
And the focus that you've done in this image is after?
That focus is done afterwards, because I also wanted to play around with proper depth of field things.
What program did you
I used Nuke. Yeah. Normal people don't care. Anyways, I think this render took me on a pretty good machine around 27 hours. Yeah. So if you want to achieve a specific point of realness, and the more stuff you add, it just takes a lot of time. But it was fun. I didn't have anything else to do at the time. So I was like, hey, let's just see how much detail you can add to something. Another thing I did while it was rendering was this one, also because I was bored and I just wanted to play around with displacements. But I don't like the bump anymore, it looks too cheap. Anyways, back to our example here. No. To our example here. I've added this. We will add the floor in a moment, but I have mainly the camera. Now, in order to give a camera depth of field, I need to go into the physical render settings and I tell it to create depth of field. Then I hit render, but I don't really get depth of field. Okay, so maybe I didn't tell it where the focus should be. So usually I need to focus on something. So I go outside of the camera and I know the focus is, oh damn it, the focus is already correct. The focus is exactly here. So a camera usually has this thing here. You want to click on the middle one, not on the outer ones, because with this one we change the field of view of the camera. And with this one we define where the focus distance is. So here I can set the focus to be on the object. Okay, so the focus is correct, but I don't get depth of field. Let me take a look at the settings of the camera. I go to the physical tab and I can see, I have an f-stop, and I have an f-stop of 8. That's all right. But it's not really that much. So what would I do with a real camera if I want more depth of field? Drop it, exactly. So I take a lower value. Let's do, for the reality, something extreme like an f-stop of 1. So that is already, that is hard. Let me render this. I mean, like in the background, I start to see a little bit, but it's not really that much. Why? I mean, in reality, if I take a picture of this, if it's like on my table, and I have an f-stop of 1, I should have a pretty strong depth of field. So why don't I have that?
Does your camera interact with the light?
Nah. Doesn't have to do with the light.
It has to do with the camera. We can imagine a real camera for this answer.
No, the camera does exactly what it should. This is correct what it does. But why is it correct? Why doesn't it blur more?
Some other settings are not very good.
It's not a setting that we have to change.
Camera position.
It kind of has to do with the camera position. Let me give you a hint. Ring radius. This is our object. And this object has a radius of 200 centimeters, which means that this object is right now 3 meters large. So if I then imagine that this thing here is 3 meters in size, let me just take a person and put it next to it. This is how large a person is. So if we now imagine we have a camera with an f-stop of 1, and we go that far back, then it's not that intense anymore. So cinema does exactly what it should. We just built something that is way too large and doesn't really live in that size that we think in. However, the camera works like a realistic camera. So the depth of field right now is pretty much non-existent. So because we built something that is unrealistically high, we will go unrealistically low with the f-stop to something like 0.01, which in reality is kind of not happening. But when I now render this, this might be probably way too intense. But here you can see maybe just 0.1 would be good enough. Yeah. Now we have a nice focus and a nice depth of field.
Would you rather not just scale the object?
Yeah.
That would also be possible, but what is easier? Scaling my entire scene, replacing the camera, readjusting the focus and everything, or just using an irrealistic number here?
When the whole file will be smaller than if you worked on a realistic scale?
No.
Would it be quicker? No.
No. Why would it be? We don't have more content. Cinema saves polygons and where they are. Just because it's larger, I mean, sure, a point will have saved a position of 10.3 centimeters instead of 10 kilometers. So per point we have smaller numbers that define where the point is. But that's just a very minimal thing. So in reality, if we have a smaller thing, we might have a slightly bit of a smaller file size. Not really. So the size here doesn't usually matter. If we work with dynamics, then the size does matter a little bit because larger elements behave differently because of air resistance and stuff like this. But as long as we don't use something like dynamics and we just have objects, then the only thing that right now behaves like a realistic camera is the f-stop, and then we just say fuck it and use values that just give the end result that we want to. Alrighty, let's do this together. Let's actually start with the material for the pedestal. There, we go to the color, and we add the wood texture. Next, we go to the reflectance, and we know the default specular not going to work. So we get rid of it. We add GGX. Go down to the layer Fresnel and change it to dielectric. If we feel, even after we add the normal map, that it's too glossy, too shiny, what you want to do is change the IOR. So just change it to a lower value. If the IOR is a higher value, it reflects more and more. So you want the IOR to be even less in order to get more of a subtle reflection on there. I don't have a specific value, it's just something that you play around with.
Default specular, I could have removed it, but it's still there, but I can't do anything with it.
So, next, we want to go to the normal channel and enable it. Then we drop the same image that we used for the color into the texture here. We can use, again, the bitmaps option. It's a little bit faster. The end result looks awful because our image is not a normal map, so it needs to be converted. To convert it, we click on the arrow here, go to Effects, and we choose the normalizer. Then we go to the editor and change the texture preview size to no scaling, and apply the material to our object. And already we should see how we have this nice little structure on there. Subtle, but it's there. Next, we just want to give this a proper size. I don't like how it's wrapping around the side. So we select our texture tag. This time we change the projection from UVW mapping to cubic. To change the size of this, the easiest way is to just go to the texture mode and use the scale tool. And just click in an empty area and scale this up to an appropriate size. So far, so good. Next, we want to create a camera, so we can add depth of field to this. To create a camera, we simply click up here. We look through the camera. We go to the Object tab and change the focal length by using the drop down, and I usually use a portrait lens for this kind of thing. So 80 millimeter. We then choose the angle that we want. And we need to double check where the focal point of the camera is. To see that, we need to go outside of the camera. No angle. Just move the camera around. Then we go outside of the camera. We can see it as this green KG thing. And we want to move the focal point to where our object is. To do so, we need to be in the model mode. And we click over or onto the little hotspot in the center of the square. It's not a square, it's a rectangle. Always look around the element and see if the point sits where you want the focus to be. So far, so good. Then we just need 2 more steps. We go into our render settings, to the physical tab, and we enable depth of field. Then we go into the physical tab of the camera, and we change the f-stop to something that works better for this scale of scene. So maybe 0.1. When we then render, we should get some nice depth of field in here. All right. So this is the first example. Just one thing to mention. If we use depth of field, the low quality usually really doesn't cut it. It will just be too grainy and noisy. Doesn't work for us. So we at least have to go to medium. And in some cases, especially when we work with reflective materials, we might actually have to go to a high quality render setting. But rendering with depth of field already takes much longer to calculate than the regular scene, and then doing it in high even increases the render time more. So it's always something that you should consider. Also, the more depth of field we see, so the more blurry it gets, the longer it takes to calculate. So if we just have a little bit of depth of field, then it doesn't take as long as if we do an extreme depth of field effect. Okay? So always keep that in mind. It does make our renderings usually look more realistic, because depth of field is something that just happens in reality. But it doesn't need to be in every single project. I mean, like for instance with the car, last session, it was last session, right? The one before? No, the one before. The Valentine's Day one. They would just faked it. They would just edit the depth of field in Photoshop on the background image beforehand, and it looked like we had depth of field. The scene itself was pretty small, so we didn't need a depth effect on it. In here, in this example, I did need it, or I did wanted it, because in the final version, I added these other two ones in the background, and this is something that I could only do either by faking it in Photoshop or After Effects, but I would never get a clean result like this. Alrighty, let's take a break for 10 minutes, and then we do the second example with the glass. Okay, now for the second example. I will do it first, afterwards we will do it together. And the first time I do it right away. And then I show you afterwards why it can be wrong, or how it could be wrong. I first start by going to my front view. In the front view, I hit Shift-V to go to my back settings, and I load in the glass image. Now, I don't want to build the glass right based on this image here, the way that it's placed, because it's not really placed in the center. And I know when I use my, how is it called? Lathe, exactly. I always want to call it revolve. Lathe is such a weird word. So when I want to use the lathe tool, it rotates around the center of the world by default. So I first want to move the glass to the correct spot. And I can do that by using the offset here. So something like this, and something like this. I do not place it with this edge here to the bottom, because I can see the camera looks at this slightly from above. So the glass does not have a rounded bottom. It's a flat surface. So I need to imagine where it would be cut off if the camera was a little bit lower. So it's just an estimate what we're doing here. Then I will use the pen tool, and I will use the B-spline. I start in the center here, create a couple of points for the bottom so it will be nice and flat. And then I can start with the rounding here, go around the edge, like this, go around the top, go through the inside, and then finish the glass up like this. Then I want to make sure that the middle is perfectly aligned in the middle. So I set the X position to 0 and the X size to 0 as well. And then I select the bottom points, and I select the Y position and the Y size to 0, so everything is nice and perfect there. Then I can go back to my view here, and I can choose the lathe, drop it inside, and I have my basic shape here. Now let me show you what it could be like if it doesn't work. So someone might be a little bit lazy and create just the outside of this. So from the side, it might look like it's exactly the same shape. So let me go over here and delete the points for the inside. Chip, 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 like this. So from here, it looks pretty much like the same thing. Let me now create just something like a disk. So I have something where it can sit on. Or actually, let me just use the setup from our scene here. Just select the sky and the cylinder, copy it, move it over, paste it. like this. Now I create a glass material, no color, in the transparency, choose glass, in the reflectance, get rid of the default specula. A glass material already adds a reflection inside here in the reflectance, so we don't need to add our own GGX to it. We already have reflection that is added by default. Then I apply it to both elements in our render. So one does not look like the other.
Because it's a solid.
This one here, it's not even a solid. Actually, if I get rid of the material here, it is pretty open. However, it is just one single wall. And the glass doesn't see thickness. It doesn't actually fill the object. It just sees, here, I enter the element. Then there's a bunch of nothing. And then the other side of the polygon happens. So here it thinks it starts to be a glass material, and there it thinks it ends to be a glass material. Here, on the other hand, it starts, then it immediately sees the other side, and then it knows I end here. Then it's air, and then it does it again. It knows glass, and then glass is ended. And because of that, we always need a little bit of thickness on our elements, otherwise they just do not behave the way that they should. They distort in a completely different way, and it feels like a filled object. A student in Hamburg then had the thing, well, we could build the cheap version and then just add a cloth surface to it to give it some thickness. So here we would create a cloth surface, place the lathe inside of it, decrease the subdivision, but give it a little bit of depth, like this. So here, oops, we now have actual thickness, which is fine, but oops, don't have the material on it anymore, but it just doesn't give us the same feeling because it is a completely equal distance, so it feels more like a very thin plastic cup, kind of. And the glass on the right is thick. We can see how it refracts in different intensities. We really see the shape that the glass is supposed to have, whereas here, this is just an equally thin cutout of something, which could be good for some cases. So if you want to create that, for instance, if you have like the cola bottle there, something that is thin and equal, then we would do that much simpler. But for the glass that we have here, we can clearly see in the picture how it has these different thicknesses, and they are important to replicate in order to get a realistic reflection there. All right, let's get to this point here together first. We start by creating a new document. Let's keep the old one open so we can copy some stuff over. Then we go to the front view. In the front view, we hit Shift-V for the viewport options. We go to the back tab, to the image, and load in the image of the glass. For the offset X and Y, for this scenario, I would recommend using a value of 80 and 190, so we are all working with the same basic placement. So far, so good? We can then increase the transparency just so that we can see the grid in our elements later on a little bit better. Next, we use the pen tool. I always recommend changing the type to B-spline. Then we start in the center at the bottom, and we create a couple of points to define that that is a flat surface. Then we start creating our curvature. And we just create more and more points along the edge here, ignoring the handle, because the handle will be added later on. You hit escape to finish editing the shape. All right. There's no shortcut. You just need to place points closer together.
So you didn't connect the last and the first one?
Oh, no. They need to be open.
I have sure.
All right. Then we go back to our perspective view. Oh, no, we don't. First, we need to make sure that our points are aligned perfectly. So we select the 2 points in the center, change the X position and X size to 0. Then we select the points at the bottom and do the same thing for the Y position and size. All right. Good. Now we can go to the perspective view, go to the extrude, and we choose the lathe, and we drop the spline into the lathe so that we have our basic element here. We good? Next, we just want to copy over the light setup that we had in the other scene. So we go back to our first scene. We select the sky and the cylinder. Copy them, move back to our scene here, and paste them in there. We select the cylinder and we simply scale it up until it has an appropriate size. If you want to, you can also go into the material, into the luminance channel of the sky, and replace it with the other HDR, which is called Bush Restaurant. Why ever? So far, so good? Okay. Then we create the glass material just to already see what's happening. We turn off the color, enable the transparency, by default, we can see that the preset is already set to glass, so that's good. And in the reflectance, we turn off the default specular or remove it because we can see how it gets super milky. So this is how the glass normally looks like, and with the default specular, it just looks wrong. So we remove it. We then apply the material to our glass, hit render, and we are amazed.
What did you remove for the glass?
The specular, default one, was in the list here. So reflectance and just the default specular should be gone.
Perfect mirror reflectance, which is really good.
Let me check. So, there's one thing that you might have noticed. You see weird black edges from certain angles. Like, even when I render it from this angle here, we can see how suddenly it's black. From some other angles, we might see it even more. Let me just go a little bit closer. Oh yeah, see how this is suddenly black? So, imagine it like this. When you are standing in a room and you have a mirror in the front and a mirror in the back, you get this infinite reflection, right? So this is what happens if one element reflects the other. And this is also what happens inside of the glass, because we have multiple walls that are continuously, infinitely reflecting inside of one another. Of course, the computer cannot calculate an infinite reflection. At some point, it just needs to stop and be done with it. And when it's done with it, it just shows black. So, if we have an object and we realize we reach this point where we have the maximum amount of reflections met, and then it looks awful, we need to go into the render settings. We can do that now together. We go into the render settings, go to the options, and there's something that is called ray depth directly next to the refraction. Oh, it's not the ray depth underneath it. I want the reflection depth. Sorry. Reflection and reflection depth. And here, it only bounces 5 times, and then it just stops and renders nothingness. So this value needs to be increased. Usually, I go in steps of 5 and see if it goes better. So here I can see it is less black, but it's still there, so 10 is obviously not enough. So let's go to 15. And now I have a nice clean glass without these weird black edges. Depending on the angle that I look at the image, it might at some point again give me some black edges somewhere, but at this point those areas should be very, very minimal. The higher the reflection depth is, the longer, however, of course, this will also take to calculate. So this is something that we always need to keep in mind. It will look more realistic and cleaner, but it also does take more time to calculate.
If you want to have this glittery effect we see now while it's rendering, is it something you would also do with a texture you put in and then work like we did on the thing before?
I would do it with a bump, because if I want it to be glittery, it just means that the surface is very irregular. So we have some highlights here and there kind of like randomly on top. So in the material, I would go first to the luminance and turn everything off so I can see how large the glitters would be. And I would try it with a noise. Going to options, enable noise. There. And maybe I make it even smaller. Maybe 30%. Then I can copy this texture, disable the luminance, turn on reflectance and transparency again. Then I go to the bump and I paste the texture.
Easy.
And when I now render, my glass has that structure. And when it then starts to render, it does take even longer because it's more detailed that it needs to calculate. But there we go. Now we get this rough glass with all these tiny little bumps on them. Let's just wait for one more. Like that. Okay? But I don't want that here. Good. Alrighty. Now let me show you how we can build the handle. Let me get rid of the glass material for now so I can see stuff a little bit better. And I will go back to my front view. I will then use the pen tool in order to create a path that goes around the area where this handle is. Like this. Maybe I adjust it a little bit further. Yeah, I'll do it only rough right now. Then I will use the sweep together with the circle. And the circle obviously needs to be scaled down by quite a bit. Then, how do I connect the two so that I have a smooth transition between them? What? No. What was it? No. No. When did we use it? Let me remember. We did use it. I don't remember how or when. With the sponge. Volume builder, exactly. So I use the volume builder and I drop my lathe and the sweep inside of that. Then I see, okay, something. Maybe I need a higher subdivision. So I go to the volume builder and I take a voxel size of 2. And then I realize, so that looks like crap. What do I have to do?
The voxels?
No, the voxels are fine now. I don't need more voxels. No.
No, you use SDF smooth.
Later.
Subdivision surface.
Later. No. My issue is, oh God, now I'm dizzy. My issue is, I don't have enough polygons here. So when I fill it with a volume, I see the separate polygons. So I need way more polygons so they don't show up in the volume builder. To do that, I go to the lathe and I give it enough subdivisions. Still not enough. It only went around it, which is fine. Maybe I do even more. But up and down, I also need more. Yes, exactly. So where? I can already tell you that it's not the lathe, so it has to be the spline. And what could be the thing that needs to change? Probably the intermediate points that are placed on the spline. Right now they are adaptive, which means sometimes we have less, sometimes we have more. So maybe I change this to something more uniform. And now I have a value that I can just increase. Don't overdo it though. Now I can turn the volume builder back on and I can see smooth surface. Then I can take the SDF smooth. I have a nice smooth connection here and I use the volume measure in order to create my actual geometry here. Then I can place my glass material back onto the volume measure, and when I now render, I have my nice glass object. Let's do this together. Yeah.
The null.
Yeah.
Just because it's no goes on yours.
it's 2. So here right now, if I go back to display and garage shading, this is what it looks like because of the glass material. So usually whenever we want to edit the glass material, you can also, okay, wait. Okay, so we want to go to our front view. In there, we use the pen tool, and we create with another B-spline the basic shape.
You just make a single line, right? You don't go back or something.
Why would I?
Okay.
Just hit escape, then you finish the path. Then I recommend for now getting rid of the material of the lathe so we can see stuff a little bit better. Then we create a sweep and we create a circle. We drop the circle and the spline into the sweep, making sure that the circle is the first element inside of the sweep. We can then scale down the circle until we have an appropriate size for the handle. If we feel like the handle is not circular, but it is more of a flat thing, we can use the same thing that I showed earlier. We could use the rectangle, for instance. And I could use the rectangle instead of the circle inside of the sweep. When I then scale it down, I can tell the rectangle to have a rounding that is super large and to be higher than wide. Is this more the shape that you were thinking it would have? So that would also be possible. I think it's hard to judge from this picture here because we see it from the side, and from the side it definitely has this shape and we don't know how deep it goes. But both are possible. I'll stick to my circle though.
How can we adjust the points?
Mm-hmm.
How can we adjust the points of the curve, the spline curve?
It's best to go back to the front view, make sure that you have the spline selected and you are in the point mode. And then you can grab the points and move them around.
And where's the circle spline? Ah, where's the circle spline?
Next, we want these two shapes to be combined into one. And for that, we will use the volume builder. I would close the sweep and the lathe just so that they are easier to select. And then we drop the two into the volume builder. We might get a pretty pixelated end result here. To make it a little bit nicer, to get more details in our geometry, we go to the volume builder and we decrease the voxel size. Don't overdo it. For this scenario here, 2 centimeters should be good place. We then realize that we see a lot of edges here. So I don't see them, I didn't undo them. So what you want to do is, you want to go to the lathe and increase the subdivisions to something over 100, rather 200. That, however, is still not good enough. So we need to go into the lathe, select the spline, change the intermediate points to uniform, and a number of 30 should work well in this example. Then we can go to the volume builder, add the SDF smooth, and lastly, add the volume measure. And drop the volume builder into the volume measure. We good?
Should be.
All right. Good. Now I want to add some liquid inside. We know cinema 4D and particles and stuff like that not gonna happen. So we'll just fake it. I go to my front view again, and I know I already have parts of the correct shape that I want here. Maybe I turn off the volume measure and the volume builder just so I can see stuff a bit better. Essentially, I can just use the lathe that I already have. I control drag it out, so I have a new lathe. I select the spline, and I just move a couple of points upwards, and I get rid of a couple of points that I don't need. And then I just move the other points that I have kind of into place. I'm missing a point. Here's one more. Then what I want to do is I want to build a shape that looks like this. So if I turn my lathe off, and also the other ones, this is the shape that I'm looking for. This is a little bit too much. But essentially, when we have water, we have this surface tension. So it is always a little bit sucked up on the sides, like that. So if we want to get a realistic reflection on there, we want to imitate this as well. So I just adjust this shape. I just want it to be a little bit, not too much, not too visible, just a little bit, just a hint of it. Then I also make sure that my water doesn't intersect with the glass. If anything, it should be a little bit away from it. So due to the reflections and such, we will not see how they touch exactly. And we just want to make sure that they are just a little bit offset from one another. In the center, I make sure that I only move it along the y-axis. From afar, I will not be able to see the distance. Now I can turn this on, duplicate the glass material that I already have. I go to the reflection, into the transparency, and I change the preset here to water. To what? It's a teacup. You don't care. It's a bottle. Anything goes in. So you can take whiskey, but if you're not an animal, let's just take the water. And we can give it a whiskey color ourselves by simply going to the color here and increasing this. So a water does not have a color. So if I add color, nothing is happening because it is transparent, so there's no color. If we want to give color to the transparency, we have to add the color inside of the transparency. So here, I would say that this is a tea color. And I apply this material to my lathe here. So when I now render this, I have my body of water. And if I enable my other geometry here as well, it needs to think because of volume builder, volume measure. And I render this. I have it filled with that liquid. All right, let's do this together. We start by going back to our front view. In the front view, we then realize we can't really see anything. So let's turn off the volume measure and the volume builder. Then we know that we can take the lathe as our reference, so we just copy it out. And we select the spline. Then we can grab some of the points that made up the bottom of the glass, and we just move it up to how much we want the glass to be filled. If this gets too messy for you, just turn off the lathe and turn off the other lathe as well. Then you only see your spline, and it's much easier to grab some points that you don't need and move the other points around.
So all the blue points that were doing the outside layers,
We don't need them.
okay.
Wait, and how do I then draw new points?
You can always add new points by going to the spline pen tool, holding down the Control or Command key, and click on the path, and then a new point will be added on the path in that point. You can also Command click on the point again to delete it.
And how do I remove that?
Also with the pen tool, or with the Move tool.
Whenever I try to add gives me this weird.
Alrighty. Next, we can go back to our perspective view, turn on the lathe of our body of water, and create the material for that body of water. We duplicate the glass material over, double-click the duplicate to open it up. In the transparency, we change the refraction to water, or whatever you are in the mood for. And inside of the transparency, we want to change the color. If you feel super fancy, you can also try changing the absorption color. So here, if I take something different, like a blue, and I make it super intense, you can see how it then mixes together. So it's just a different part of the glass material, so you get a more dynamic color. But usually I keep it white. Then we apply this material to the lathe, and we could render this. I think it looks fine. So we can turn the other lathe and the volume builder and the volume mesher back on. When we then render it together, we should get something like this. So far, so good?
Glass material is on the volume measure, not on the volume
Yes.
builder.
Volume mesher.
So just like this, well, I mean, even still, it just keeps, it's great.
Are we good? Okay. Now for the last part. You might remember on the render that I showed you, even though it wasn't finished, there was a sticker on top. So how could we add that one? So we know that this is super tricky because when we project it, it will be projected to the front and the back and the other inside and the other back. So we would have the sticker 4 times on the glass. Or we make it editable, but then we lose all the possibilities of changing the shape later on. So that also sucks. So let me show you another alternative of working with something like the sticker. And that is by using a deformer. I will show it to you in another example first. Take a look so you understand how it works. I could have, for instance, a plane, and I could have a sphere, and the sphere should push the plane down. I will just go to my deformers, and I will choose the collision deformer. I drop the collision deformer into the plane, then I take the sphere, go to the colliders, I take the sphere and drop it into the colliders list. And now I can see that I can move the sphere around and it's intersecting with it. This is has nothing to do with dynamics or soft bodies. It's just literally seeing there's geometry, so I'm just pushing points away from there. Unfortunately, this always has kind of like an inside and an outside that is calculated automatically. So if I push too far down, it pretends it's being pushed from the other side. Normally, in abstract cases like this, I would hide the sphere so I can just literally push something through like that. If I want to push it even further, I need to tell the collision deformer that it shouldn't do the detection automatically. So here we either use the inside stretch or the outside volume. I think I want to use the inside stretch for this, because now I can take this and I can drag it even higher so it doesn't switch to the other side. And the same thing I can then do with a sticker. I create a new material. In the material, I go to the color and I add the logo. It should have transparency. However, I will not use transparency. I will actually use an alpha. I don't want it to be like glass. When there's no logo, there should be nothingness. So it's not transparency, it is an alpha. And I use the same image here as well. In the reflectance, just to be consistent, I choose GGX and I choose a Fresnel of dielectric. So I have a nice glossy plastic sticker. I create a plane and I apply the material to the plane. I select the plane and I want to give it roughly the size that belongs to the image. If I go to my color, I can see that the image is 500 by 610. I simply go to the plane and I give it the same size, 500 by 610. Now I can roughly move it into place. But then I realize it's kind of hard when I don't see the glass, really. So what I will do is, I will go to the options. Nope. Oh, options. I go down and I turn off materials. So this way it just turns all the materials off, which makes it easy for me to see stuff. Then I can adjust the rotation here and move it kind of like into place, like that. Then I use the collision deformer. Do I put it into my volume measure or do I put it into the plane? Exactly, because the plane is the one that needs to collide, that needs to be deformed. Then in the collision deformer, I go to the colliders, drag the volume measure inside, and I tell it to be inside stretch. And now I can take the plane and just push it against it, and it will nicely wrap around it. Sometimes it doesn't wrap completely on the tiny edges. Not quite sure why that happens. I could spend some time in here and adjust the advanced options, but I'm too lazy, and since it's a transparent object, I don't see the edges. I don't care at the moment. So I can go back to my options and turn the materials back on. And now I have the Fairtrade logo nicely stuck to the element. Maybe a little bit too large. Let's make it a bit smaller. And that's it. Let's do this together. We create a new material. In the material, we go to the color channel. We go to the texture. Texture, ... And then we choose the Fairtrade logo. We need to have the same logo in the alpha channel as well. So we go to the alpha, enable it, click on the arrow, and choose the same image from the bitmaps. Then we go to the reflectance, get rid of the default specular, and we add a GGX reflection. We open the layer Fresnel and change it to dielectric. Then, so far so good? Then we create a plane and apply the sticker to the plane. We give the plane the same centimeter size as the image has a pixel size, which is 500 by 610. Then we switch to the model mode and just rotate and move the element roughly in place. Now to see stuff a little bit better, let's turn off all the textures. So we go to display, no, options, all the way down, and we click on materials. And now we should just see everything in gray. Then we use the collision deformer, drop it into the plane. And we need to tell the collision deformer what it should collide with. So we go to the Colliders tab, and we drop the volume measure inside the objects list. We change the solver to inside stretch, and now we can move the plane and it will wrap around it. That now helps me a lot. So if we are annoyed that the edges are a little bit away, we can just make the texture a little bit smaller. So when I switch back to my material so I can see them, I can go to my material tag and I can just scale my thing down. Maybe I scale it down to 80%. I make sure that it doesn't tile. Why does it turn off then? That's interesting. Since when? Now let's see if it stays there. And then just offset it so it's nicely centered. Really? That's what it does? That's okay. If we don't tile the material and it does this, the solution is funny. You simply create a material that has nothing, and it only has an alpha that is completely turned on, like this. So it's just a material with nothingness. And we apply this material first. So first, the plane is nothing. And then the other element is added on top, fixed. Yeah. It's an awkward solution, but it works. Alrighty. And that is everything I wanted to talk about today. Good. Since I need to go to the 8th quarter right now, I would say, again, no homework, but I want you to send me this weekend kind of like your thoughts on what you want to do for the face-to-face. So not by next session, really this weekend, you send me an email with what you plan to do for the face-to-face. Maybe you've already started with something. It is face-to-face already?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, then, well, definitely. Oh, that is so true. Oh, damn it. Yeah, so good luck. Just send me what you have on the weekend. Then I can give you some tips and pointers if you're like, okay, so I know how to build this and that, but I have issues here and there. And my God, it's already next week. I always forget that it's in Berlin always a week earlier than in Hamburg. That's why we had the double session and such.
Did you say that you have like a list of requirements we have?
Yeah. I'll send it around this time as well. It's just all the basic things like use shadows when you create lights. And stuff like that. Alrighty.
Face-to-face will then bring you the file or the finished rendered product.
The finished rendered product. So for the face-to-face, it will be one after the other, just comes in, show me what you've built, then we talk about it a little bit, and then that's already it. Oh my God, and this was the last session.
Yeah.
Holy crap, this went way too fast. Alrighty. So, as you know, there's also, or there was in the past, an advanced course for this. In the email that I sent you, I will also send you a link to the advanced course that I taught last quarter, because in there I'll also teach some more advanced techniques, but mainly in that course I talk about how to animate things. So I will send you, yeah, it is sad. I hope that it gets reintroduced, but it will probably take a year or so. That's just how life goes. Anyways, but the recordings are there, so you can watch them, and if you have questions, you can always send me an email and ask me stuff about anything. Well, cinema 4D related and such. Well, you can also ask me about anything else, but I might not know anything else. Alrighty, then I hope you had fun in these classes, you learned a lot, and also especially that you have tools that you can use in other work projects that you have as well. Goodie, then.
Thank you so much. Well, we will see you also after face-to-face for the portfolio session.
Yeah.
So is there anything we can prepare for that?
For the portfolio session, just continue where we left off in the last class. So make sure that you have a clear idea of the direction that you want to go, what kind of projects that you want to put in. In that session, I will talk to you kind of like one-on-one, and we will just figure out how your website is supposed to look like, and then I get you started on how to actually building it.
If we already know the domain we want,
Just tell it to me then.
and if we already have a domain,
We will also talk about it then.
okay. No,
Yeah.
because the domain takes a few days, I guess, so if
Yeah, but you only need it to be finished in the first week of the next quarter, so we have the entire break for the domain to be transferred if necessary. Okay, goodie. Then, that's it. Have a nice weekend. Looking forward to your emails and see you next week.